On the 3rd of March, 1943, the Bismarck Sea near New Guinea was the scene of a critical naval engagement. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, leading Destroyer Squadron 3 with 8 destroyers, was tasked with escorting 8 transport vessels. These ships were laden with 6,900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division. Their mission was to reinforce law at any cost, employing any means necessary. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General George Kenney's U.S. 5th Air Force B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, each uniquely retrofitted by Major Paul Gunn, with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber Browning machine guns, were prepared to intercept. As the morning sun ascended over the Bismarck Sea, Admiral Kimura observed the destroyer Shiryuki, leading a formation that represented Japan's final, desperate bid to supply New Guinea by sea. Behind it, 8 transport vessels pitched and rolled in the waves, their holds brimming with soldiers, vital munitions, fuel, and the very future of Japanese operations in the Southwest Pacific. Encircling these transports, 8 destroyers maintained a vigilant screen, their anti-aircraft cannons aimed skyward, crews scanning the horizon for the inevitable arrival of American bombers. Kimura, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, ranked 107th out of 118 cadets, possessed a record that was far from stellar. However, the crucible of war had imparted lessons that transcended formal instruction. He had witnessed firsthand the devastation wrought by American air power during the Battle of Midway, having assisted in the rescue of survivors from the heavy cruiser Makuma after it was obliterated by American bombers. He fully understood the peril of Japanese vessels caught in daylight without adequate fighter protection. Yet, the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had left him with no alternative. The troops aboard these transports were critically needed at law, and every other conceivable route involved an arduous trek of over 140 miles through disease-infested jungle, devoid of any roads. The convoy had commenced its journey from Simpson Harbor at Rabaul just after midnight on March 1st, strategically leveraging storm fronts for concealment. Kimura's destroyer contingent comprised some of the Imperial Navy's most seasoned vessels: Shiryuki, Shikonami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo. Each had endured the brutal fighting around Guadalcanal, their crews seasoned veterans of night battles, where Japanese destroyer tactics had often outmaneuvered their American counterparts. But this scenario was starkly different, daylight in waters dominated by American land-based air power. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, was aboard the destroyer Tokitsukaze, while Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano of the 51st Division had secured passage on Yukikaze. The presence of such high-ranking officers underscored the convoy's paramount importance. These were not expendable units, but elite formations whose successful deployment to law could determine whether Japan retained its tenuous hold on New Guinea or faced the collapse of its entire campaign. At his headquarters in Port Moresby, Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenney meticulously studied reconnaissance photographs of the Japanese convoy, his gaze as focused as a hunter examining animal tracks. Kenney had arrived in the Southwest Pacific in July of 1942 to find General Douglas MacArthur's air forces demoralized and largely ineffective. Conventional bombing strategies had proven futile against moving ships, with medium-altitude attacks yielding hit rates of less than 1%. However, Kenney possessed a quality his predecessors lacked: an innovative intellect, willing to challenge established doctrine, coupled with the engineering acumen to implement radical modifications successfully. A pivotal figure in Kenney's revolution of Pacific air warfare stood beside him, examining the same photographs: Major Paul Papy Gunn. A former enlisted Navy aviator whose wife and children were trapped in the Philippines, Gunn had channeled his personal anguish into developing revolutionary aircraft modifications. Gunn recognized that effectively attacking ships necessitated an extremely close approach, demanding the suppression of anti-aircraft fire before delivering ordnance. His solution was elegantly simple. The bomb bay of B-25 Mitchell medium bombers was repurposed, and 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns were installed in the nose and wing pods. These modified B-25C-1 aircraft had demonstrated devastating efficacy in earlier trials. Each machine gun could discharge 850 rounds per minute, unleashing armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds at a velocity of 2,910 feet per second. 8 guns firing in concert could deliver 6,800 rounds per minute onto a target, a firepower sufficient to shred any ship's superstructure and eliminate its anti-aircraft crews. The pilots termed this approach skip bombing, involving an approach at wavetop height and the release of bombs approximately 500 yards from the target. The bombs would then skip across the water's surface, much like stones thrown from the hand, detonating against the ship's hull below the waterline, where armor protection was weakest. As Kenny and Gunn strategized their assault, they grasped its implications, extending far beyond the mere sinking of Japanese vessels. This convoy represented Japan's final viable opportunity to reinforce Leh. Its success could enable Japanese forces to stabilize their position in New Guinea and potentially pose a direct threat to Australia itself. Its failure would compel Japan to rely solely on submarines and small coastal barges, effectively ceding control of New Guinea's waters to Allied forces. The modified B-25s that would spearhead Kenny's offensive signified a radical departure from pre-war bombing doctrine. Traditional thinking emphasized precision bombing from medium altitudes, utilizing the Norden bomb sight, a sophisticated mechanical computer promising pinpoint accuracy. However, moving vessels presented challenges that the Norden's designers had not anticipated. By the time bombs descended from 10,000 feet, ships could alter course and evade the blast radius. Skip bombing circumvented this issue by reducing the release altitude to under 250 feet, thereby shortening the bomb's time of flight to mere seconds. Major Ed Lunner commanded the 92nd Bombardment Squadron's B-25s, which were designated to lead the skip bombing attack. Eleanor had rigorously trained his crews, employing a half-submerged wreck in Port Moresby Harbor as a target for practice. Each pilot learned to utilize reference points on their aircraft's nose, eschewing the traditional bomb sight, and to release their ordnance at the precise moment required to achieve the flat trajectory essential for skip bombing. Although one crew had perished when their B-25 collided with the target's mast, Lunner's surviving pilots had achieved an almost uncanny accuracy with their unconventional technique. The aircraft that would execute Kenny's plan embodied the zenith of 1943 aviation technology, ingeniously adapted for a mission its original designers had never envisioned: the B-25C-1. Mitchell, with an empty weight of 21,100 pounds, could carry 3,200 pounds of bombs and achieve a maximum speed of 275 miles per hour. However, Gunn's modifications had transformed these medium bombers into unprecedented aerial platforms, capable of both devastating strafing and bombing runs. The forward-firing armament alone weighed over 1,200 pounds, encompassing the guns, ammunition, and reinforced mounting structures engineered to withstand the immense recoil generated by 8 machine guns firing simultaneously. The Royal Australian Air Force provided crucial supporting elements for Kenny's offensive. 13 Bristol Beaufighter twin-engine fighters from No. 30 Squadron, armed with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, were ideally suited for suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Unlike the American B-25s, these aircraft were designed from inception as fighters, featuring armor protection for their pilots and self-sealing fuel tanks to enhance survivability in combat. Their role was to clear the convoy's decks of gunners just prior to the skip bombers' arrival, thereby maximizing the Americans' chances of survival during their low-altitude bombing runs. As dawn broke on March 2nd, the Japanese convoy was approximately 200 miles from Leh. It maintained its course and speed, despite a growing awareness that Allied reconnaissance aircraft had indeed detected them. Kimura's radio operators intercepted an escalating volume of American radio traffic, a clear indication that offensive preparations were underway. The admiral faced a grim dilemma: maintain speed towards Leh, thereby accepting the certainty of aerial assault, or disperse his convoy, risking the loss of most transports to submarine attacks in the confined waters approaching New Guinea. The initial American attack commenced at 10 o'clock in the morning on March 2nd, when 8 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers approached the convoy from an altitude of 7,000 feet. These four-engine aircraft represented America's pre-war bombing philosophy, intended for the destruction of industrial targets through precision, high-altitude assaults against ships. However, their effectiveness against naval targets remained questionable. The B-17S released 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs that generated spectacular water plumes, but resulted in only a single direct hit, sinking the transport Kayo Maru. More significantly, the attack disrupted the convoy's tight formation, rendering the ships vulnerable to the low-level assault that Kenny was orchestrating. Observing from the bridge of the Shiryuki, Admiral Kimura assessed the damage with mounting apprehension. One transport lost, others scattered across several miles of ocean, and this was merely a preliminary engagement. Intelligence reports confirmed a dramatic increase in American air strength in New Guinea over recent months, introducing new aircraft types and tactical approaches previously unencountered by Japanese forces. The Admiral's gravest concern was not the bombs themselves, but the potential for his ships to be caught dispersed and unable to offer mutual anti-aircraft support when the main offensive materialized. Throughout the night of March 2nd and into the 3rd, Royal Australian Air Force consolidated PBY Catalina. Flying boats shadowed the convoy, transmitting positional data that enabled Kenny's forces to plan their attack with precision. These twin-engine seaplanes, capable of remaining airborne for over 20 hours, were ideally suited for extended reconnaissance missions. Their crews understood that maintaining contact with the convoy was critical for the success of the following day's operation, even though their slow, lumbering aircraft were exceptionally vulnerable to Japanese fighters. As March 3rd dawned, clear and calm, Kimura found himself commanding a convoy that had already forfeited 1/8 of its transport capacity, while still 60 miles from Leh. His destroyers had rescued 950 survivors from the Kayo Maru, but the overcrowded warships now carried hundreds of additional soldiers beyond their normal complement. Compounding the problem, the dispersed formation meant that when the next attack arrived, his ships would face it individually rather than concentrating their anti-aircraft firepower. At 7:30 in the morning, reconnaissance aircraft reported that Allied bombers were lifting off from airfields around Port Moresby. Kimura ordered his ships to close formation and prepare for coordinated evasive action, fully aware of the fundamental disadvantage his convoy faced. Japanese air cover consisted of approximately 100 fighters based at Leh, but these aircraft lacked the operational range to provide continuous protection along the convoy's route. Allied forces, conversely, could launch attacks from multiple airfields, employing diverse aircraft types in meticulously coordinated waves. The engagement that would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea commenced at 10 o'clock in the morning on March 3rd, as the initial wave of Allied aircraft appeared on the horizon. Kimura immediately ordered all vessels to increase speed and initiate evasive maneuvers, but the convoy's tight formation severely restricted his options. The transports laden with troops and supplies could not match the speed or maneuverability of the destroyers, forcing the faster warships to choose between abandoning their charges or accepting the limitations imposed by escorting slow-moving targets. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters approached the convoy at wave-top height, their twin engines emitting a distinctive sound that Japanese lookouts had come to dread. These aircraft, originally designed as night fighters equipped with rudimentary airborne radar, proved equally effective in daylight strafing attacks. Each Beaufighter carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons in its nose, weapons capable of penetrating light armor and destroying exposed equipment with explosive shells, rather than simple machine gun rounds. The Beaufighter attack adhered precisely to Kenny's tactical plan. Instead of approaching from disparate directions, all 13 aircraft converged from the starboard side of the convoy, compelling Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to concentrate their fire on a single sector. This left other defensive stations temporarily unmanned, creating the crucial opening that guns modified B-25s required to commence their skip bombing runs. The timing had been rehearsed exhaustively, with each pilot understanding that success hinged on split-second coordination between aircraft types possessing vastly different capabilities. Major Lollner led 12 B-25 C-1 strafing aircraft in their approach, moments after the Beaufighters concluded their strafing runs. Flying at an altitude of 30 feet above the waves at 230 miles per hour, the American bombers presented targets that Japanese gunners found nearly impossible to track. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine presupposed attackers approaching from medium altitudes, affording defenders time to calculate range and deflection. Skip bombers eliminated this advantage by compressing the entire attack into seconds rather than minutes. The roar of Lohner's B-25s was unlike anything Japanese sailors had ever experienced. 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously produced a cacophony, described by one survivor as akin to a giant canvas being ripped apart by unseen forces. Each aircraft carried 3,840 rounds of mixed ammunition, armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate steel, incendiary rounds to ignite fires, and tracer rounds to assist pilots in aiming. At a range of 200 yards, these weapons could pierce the hull plating of any destroyer and obliterate exposed personnel with devastating efficacy. The Shiryuki sustained the first concentrated burst from Lohner's lead aircraft, just as the admiral was ordering emergency turns to evade the incoming bombers. 50 caliber bullets swept across the destroyer's bridge, killing or severely wounding most of the officers and men stationed there. Admiral Kimura himself sustained machine gun wounds to his shoulder and stomach, injuries that would have proven fatal without immediate medical intervention. The same volley that wounded the admiral also destroyed the ship's primary fire control equipment, rendering its anti-aircraft guns directionless. The skip bombing technique perfected by Gunn and Lohner proved devastatingly effective against vessels designed to withstand conventional high-altitude bombing. Traditional naval armor concentrated protection around vital areas like magazines and engine rooms, predicated on the assumption that bombs would descend from above. Skip bombs approached from the flank, striking areas where hull plating was thinnest and least protected. A 500-pound bomb detonating against a destroyer's side could rupture compartments below the waterline, initiating flooding that would sink the vessel within minutes. Transport ships proved even more vulnerable to skip bombing assaults than the destroyers escorting them. These vessels were designed for cargo capacity rather than combat survivability, featuring minimal armor and inadequate subdivision to contain flooding. When B-25s attacked the transport Toimaru, their combined machine gun fire decimated dozens of soldiers packed into the ship's holds, while their bombs ripped massive holes in its hull. The vessel began to sink immediately, forcing hundreds of troops to abandon ship into waters, soon to be churned with debris, fuel, oil, and blood. The systematic annihilation of Kimura's convoy unfolded with mechanical precision, as each wave of Allied aircraft encountered its targets dispersed and incapable of offering mutual support. B-17. Flying fortresses attacked from medium altitudes, while B-25 strafers descended to wave-top height, forcing Japanese gunners to divide their attention between threats approaching from entirely different vectors. Douglas A. 20 Havoc light bombers further compounded the confusion by attacking from yet another angle, their crews employing the same low-level tactics that had proven so effective for the modified B-25s. As ships began to founder throughout the convoy, thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors found themselves adrift in the sea, with only life preservers, floating debris, or their swimming abilities to sustain them. The transport ships carried Type A and Type B landing craft that could theoretically evacuate troops, but most of these had been destroyed by strafing before they could be launched. Those landing craft that did manage to reach the water carried between 30 and 90 men each, depending on their size, but they represented a minuscule fraction of the convoy's total personnel. Admiral Kimura, bleeding profusely from his wounds, was transferred from the sinking Shiryuki to the destroyer Shikonami as American aircraft persisted in their assault. From his new flagship, he could comprehend the full magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. All 8 transports were either sinking or ablaze, while 3 of his 8 destroyers had been sunk or critically damaged. The meticulously planned reinforcement of Laes had devolved into a massacre, with thousands of elite Japanese troops perishing before they could fire a single shot in defense of New Guinea. The 4 surviving destroyers, Shikonami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, commenced rescue operations immediately, plucking survivors from the oil-slicked waters as rapidly as their crews could manage. These ships, designed to carry approximately 240 officers and men each, now bore the burden of hundreds of additional survivors from the sunken vessels. Overcrowding became so severe that some destroyers had survivors lashed to their decks, exposed to subsequent air attacks, but alive when they might otherwise have drowned. Lieutenant General George Kenney observed the initial reports of his offensive success with profound satisfaction. Yet, he recognized that the battle was far from concluded. Intelligence assessments indicated that over 6,000 Japanese troops had been aboard the convoy's transports, and a significant number of these men remained alive in the water or in the lifeboats and landing craft that had survived the initial onslaught. Should these survivors reach the shore, they could still reinforce Lay's garrison and potentially stabilize Japanese positions in New Guinea. The decision that would elevate the Battle of the Bismarck Sea to one of the Pacific War's most contentious episodes occurred during Kenney's staff conference on the afternoon of March 3rd. Major General Andis Whitehead, Kenney's deputy commander, pointed out that hundreds of Japanese personnel were still alive in lifeboats, rafts, and landing craft scattered across the engagement area. Many of these craft were equipped with small engines and could potentially reach the New Guinea coast within days. Even those without power might drift ashore or be rescued by Japanese submarines. Kenney's response would be recalled decades later by the air crews who received his orders. "I want every goddamn Japanese in the water killed. I don't want any of them reaching shore to fight us again." The general's language mirrored the ferocity of Pacific War combat, and a calculated assessment that eliminating these survivors was a military imperative. These were not merchant mariners or civilian passengers, but elite combat troops whose survival could directly influence future engagements. The directives issued to Allied squadrons on the afternoon of March 3rd were euphemistically termed mopping up operations. Yet their intent was unmistakably clear. Aircraft were ordered to seek out and attack any lifeboats, rafts, or other vessels containing Japanese survivors. The justification provided to air crews emphasized that these individuals were soldiers who would rejoin the conflict if rescued, not helpless shipwreck victims deserving of mercy. Some pilots accepted this rationale without reservation, while others grappled with orders that appeared to contravene traditional principles of military honor. The Royal Australian Air Force's 31st Squadron received its initial directive to target Japanese survivors. On the afternoon of March 3rd, 10 Bristol Beaufighters departed from Milne Bay, tasked with locating and eliminating any barges, lifeboats, or rafts still adrift in the engagement zone. The aviators discovered their objectives dispersed across an expanse of ocean, approaching 20 square miles. They observed Type A and Type B landing craft, each laden with between 30 and 90 survivors, standard vessels, smaller boats carrying from 6 to 10 survivors to 12 men, and makeshift rafts constructed from salvaged wreckage. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Uren led the inaugural methodical strafing offensive against Japanese personnel who had survived the naval engagement. His Beaufighters, armed with 4 20mm cannons, shredded a Tayo landing craft that was carrying approximately 60 soldiers. The explosive rounds, engineered to disable aircraft, proved exceptionally lethal against unarmored vessels, transforming wood and metal into lethal fragments that mortally wounded or killed everyone on board. Uren's wingman engaged a second landing craft with comparable results, leaving only scattered remnants and casualties floating in water that rapidly turned crimson with blood. The psychological repercussions among Allied air crews varied significantly, contingent upon individual disposition and prior exposure to combat. Certain pilots, especially those who had personally witnessed Japanese brutality inflicted upon prisoners of war or civilian populations, approached these strafing missions with eagerness. Others found these attacks profoundly unsettling, subsequently articulating feelings of revulsion and disgrace that lingered long after the conflict's conclusion. Squadron leaders generally endorsed these operations as indispensable military actions, while concurrently acknowledging the inherent moral quandaries. American B-25 crews received comparable instructions on March 4th, with specific orders to actively seek out and destroy any surviving Japanese personnel or vessels intended for their rescue. Captain Charles Howe, belonging to the 92nd Bombardment Squadron, documented engaging a collection of lifeboats and rafts situated approximately 40 miles southeast of Finschhafen, expending 2,500 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition across 3 strafing runs. His post-engagement report noted that the individuals in the water had been definitively rendered inoperative, a military euphemism for mass execution, that circumvented direct acknowledgement of the actual events. The systematic pursuit of Japanese survivors persisted for 3 days following the primary engagement, with Allied aircraft covering hundreds of square miles of ocean to ensure no one could escape. United States Navy motor torpedo boat squadrons also participated, utilizing their machine guns to engage survivors at point-blank range during nocturnal operations. Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins directed 8 PT boats in these assaults, later reporting the destruction of numerous lifeboats and the demise of hundreds of Japanese servicemen and sailors. Japanese submarines, I-17 and I-26, attempted rescue efforts during the nights of March 4th and 5th, managing to retrieve 2 175 survivors before Allied aerial patrols compelled them to submerge. These submarines represented Japan's most sophisticated underwater technology, yet they could only accommodate a fraction of the men still alive in the water. The submarine captains faced agonizing choices regarding whom to prioritize for rescue, frequently compelled to abandon wounded individuals in favor of those with the greatest prospects for survival. The ethical complexity of the strafing operations became evident in the widely divergent responses from Allied air crews. Co-pilot First Lieutenant John Donegan of the 405th Bombardment Squadron recorded in his personal journal, "Our destruction was not motivated by mercy. It was simply that to us, all Japanese soldiers had become entities to be eradicated, not necessarily cruelly, but always completely." This dehumanization of the adversary reflected months of relentless combat in which neither side showed much leniency. Other aircrew members grappled with orders that appeared to contravene fundamental principles of military honor. Several Australian aviators recounted feelings of distaste regarding the targeting of defenseless survivors. While certain American crews questioned the consistency of these strafing missions with international legal standards, squadron commanders typically addressed these concerns by emphasizing the military imperative of preventing enemy reinforcement and reminding their crews of the atrocities perpetrated by the Japanese against Allied prisoners and civilians. The strategic ramifications of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate annihilation of Admiral Masato Kimura's convoy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, characterized the defeat as inconceivable and a devastating blow that fundamentally compromised Japan's operational capacity in the Southwest Pacific. The loss of 8 transport vessels and 4 destroyers constituted a substantial portion of Japan's dwindling merchant fleet, ships that could not be readily replaced given the impact of American submarine warfare on Japanese shipbuilding resources. More significantly, the battle underscored that Japan could no longer transit large convoys through waters under the dominion of Allied land-based aviation. Future reinforcement endeavors would necessitate reliance on submarines, smaller coastal craft, and hazardous overland routes, all of which Japanese planners had sought to circumvent. This logistical strangulation would ultimately prove decisive in the New Guinea campaign, forcing Japanese forces to endure inadequate provisions and reinforcements, while Allied strength continued to escalate. The international legal implications of the survivor strafing would not be fully elucidated until after the war's conclusion. The Geneva Convention of 1949 specifically prohibited attacks on shipwrecked military personnel, a provision many historians believe was directly influenced by events such as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. During World War II, however, no explicit international law protected military survivors of sunken warships, leaving commanders to make determinations based on military necessity and individual conscience. German submarine warfare presented a comparable scenario that highlighted the ethical ambiguity surrounding attacks on survivors. The Laconia incident in September 1942 saw the German U-boat U-156 attempt to rescue survivors from a torpedoed British transport, only to be attacked by Allied aircraft while displaying Red Cross insignia. This incident precipitated the Laconia Order, which forbade German submarines from undertaking rescue missions, thereby effectively condemning thousands of Allied merchant mariners to death in subsequent attacks. The parallels between the Laconia incident and the Bismarck Sea strafing reflected the total war ethos that defined World War II combat. Both German and Allied commanders found themselves in situations where conventional notions of military honor clashed with what they perceived as military imperatives. The resulting decisions frequently entailed accepting moral compromises that would have been inconceivable in earlier conflicts, but appeared justifiable given the stakes of global warfare. Post-war analysis of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea revealed the profound extent to which revolutionary tactics had reshaped naval warfare. Skip bombing, the brainchild of Paul Gunn and Ed Larner, had proven more effective against ships than conventional high-altitude precision bombing. The concentrated firepower achieved by modified B-25s surpassed that of many contemporary fighters while retaining the bomb-carrying capacity of medium bombers. These advancements would shape aircraft design and operational strategies for decades following the war's end. The human cost of the battle mirrored the broader brutality of Pacific War engagements. Japanese casualties totaled approximately 3,000 killed and missing, including many elite troops from the 51st Division, who were designated to defend Luzon. Allied losses amounted to a mere 13 aircrew members and 4 aircraft, a disparity that demonstrated the overwhelming advantage gained through technological innovation and tactical surprise. For the families of the Japanese soldiers and sailors lost in the battle, however, statistical figures offered little solace. Admiral Masadatoi Kimura survived his injuries and was evacuated to Japan for medical treatment, but his naval career effectively concluded with the Bismarck Sea defeat. Post-war interviews revealed his persistent bitterness concerning the insufficient air cover provided for his convoy and the unrealistic expectations placed upon naval forces operating within range of enemy land-based aircraft. Like many Japanese officers, Kimura struggled to comprehend how his nation's initial superiority in naval aviation had been so thoroughly overturned by American industrial output and tactical ingenuity. The aircrews who participated in the survivor strafing carried their experiences in diverse ways throughout the remainder of their lives. Some, like Captain Charles Howe, continued to advocate for the missions as necessary military actions that expedited the war's end and preserved Allied lives. Others, particularly those who witnessed the destruction of lifeboats filled with wounded individuals, grappled with memories that no amount of military justification could fully assuage. The psychological impact of these operations contributed to what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder among World War II veterans. Major Paul Gunn persisted in refining his aircraft modifications throughout the war, eventually developing B-25 variants capable of carrying up to 18 forward-firing machine guns. His innovations influenced the design of specialized attack aircraft, such as the Douglas A-26 Invader, which integrated many of the lessons learned from the modified B-25s. Gunn's personal motivation remained unwavering. Every Japanese soldier or sailor killed represented one less enemy who might endanger his family still trapped in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur characterized the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as one of the most complete and annihilating engagements of all time, rhetoric that reflected both the magnitude of the victory and the propaganda value of demonstrating Allied air supremacy. The battle's strategic significance became evident in the subsequent months as Japanese forces in New Guinea found themselves increasingly isolated and unable to receive adequate reinforcements or supplies. Leh fell to Allied forces in September 1943, followed by other Japanese strongholds as the campaign progressed. The technological legacy of the battle extended beyond aviation into broader considerations of military innovation and adaptation. The success of skip bombing demonstrated the value of challenging established doctrines when circumstances demanded novel approaches. Traditional medium-altitude bombing had proven ineffective against ships, but creative modifications to existing aircraft and tactics yielded devastating results. This pattern of innovation under duress would characterize much of America's technological development during World War II. The ethical questions raised by the survivor strafing continue to be subjects of historical debate 80 years after the battle occurred. Military historians generally acknowledge these missions as breaches of conventional military honor, while noting the absence of clear international law governing such situations during World War II. The inclusion of specific protections for shipwrecked military personnel in the 1949 Geneva Conventions represented a direct acknowledgement that such incidents should not be repeated in future conflicts. Contemporary understanding of the battle must incorporate the context of Pacific War brutality that shaped the conduct of all participants. Japanese forces had established precedents for treating prisoners with extreme cruelty, while Allied forces had witnessed atrocities that fueled a desire for retribution. The mutual dehumanization resulting from this cycle of violence made decisions like the survivor strafing more probable, even as individual participants grasped the inherent moral complexities. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ultimately showcased both the devastating efficacy of innovative military tactics and the moral compromises that total war imposed upon all involved. Admiral Kimura's convoy had represented Japan's final realistic prospect of reinforcing New Guinea by sea, while General Kenny's response ensured that such attempts would not recur. The cost of this strategic triumph included not only the 3,000 Japanese military personnel who perished during the battle and its aftermath, but also the moral burden borne by Allied air crews who participated in the survivor strafing. The technological innovations pioneered during the engagement would influence military aviation for decades. Concurrently, the ethical quandaries presented by the survivor strafing would contribute to the evolution of international humanitarian law. Both legacies reflect the intricate nature of military innovation during wartime, where tactical necessity and moral considerations frequently clash in seemingly irreconcilable ways. The men who fought and died in the Bismarck Sea deserve remembrance not only for their valor and sacrifice, but also for the difficult moral choices their circumstances compelled. As the sun dipped below the horizon on March 5, 1943, the waters of the Bismarck Sea held only wreckage and deceased bodies to mark the site where Japan's final effort to reinforce New Guinea by sea had culminated in catastrophic failure. The strategic consequences would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. Meanwhile, the ethical questions arising from the survivor strafing would influence international jurisprudence and military ethics for generations to come. Ultimately, the battle exemplified both the devastating effectiveness of American industrial innovation and the moral complexity that characterized the total war environment of World War II.